Coming to paperback and Kindle this fall, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this time-traveling, action-packed E-Steam series adventure. Pre-order your copy of E-Steam Blast from the Past on Kindle with a bonus E-Steam comic or wait for the paperback this fall. When I take a critical examination of DC's future state, I think a lot about what Albert Einstein said about the definition of insanity. Now, your Albert Einstein stated that the definition of insanity was doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. And many of the people who were in charge of DC's editorial, when they look at DC's future state, they believe they're doing something different. However, what they're doing is the exact same thing that failed over a decade ago when Dan Didio launched the New 52. Now, back in 2011, your Dan Didio and Warner Brothers thought they were doing something revolutionary when they were going to end the classic DC universe in 2011 with Flashpoint, and then use Flashpoint to launch a new DC universe with the New 52. Unfortunately, most comic fans did not like the New 52, and the entire DC brand suffered for an entire decade. Because in the aftermath of the launch of the New 52, DC Comics sales plummeted because most comic fans used that as a jumping point to get off the DC universe, and your DC merchandising suffered because many toy collectors simply stopped buying toy lines like DC Universe Classics and DC Collectibles, even though many had been buying these products religiously for over a decade. And even products like Fisher-Price Imaginext and other toy lines and merchandising suffered as a result of DC changing from its classic DC universe to the New 52, and merchandising suffered, and even DC's cinematic plans also suffered as well. So this decision to go with the New 52 was a complete disaster all across the board. However, that didn't stop DC from doubling down for several years until they decided, after hemorrhaging so much money, to try to regroup by doing the Convergence and then eventually the Rebirth. Unfortunately, the same forces that were undermining DC, like Dan Didio, wound up rising again, and as they started to rise again, we started to get plans to decide to reboot the DC universe once more. And your Dan Didio originally planned to reboot the DC universe with something called 5G. Thankfully, what happened was Warner Brothers was sold to AT&T, and AT&T finally did something I said Warner Brothers should have done when it was on its own: fired Dan Didio. And what happened was they were left with a whole bunch of pages that were paid for with this whole 5G. And instead of just eating the cost on all of those failed projects, what they wanted to do was relaunch them as a short-term event similar to Age of Apocalypse called Future State. Unfortunately, this plan to launch your DC Future State, what has happened with it is it's going to start another round in a vicious cycle, and it's one that DC Comics may not be able to survive this time around. Now, as everybody remembers, as I stated in the early part of the video, back in 2011, DC Comics wound up taking huge losses as a result of the New 52, and these losses cost them market share as related to their comic publishing division, and it cost them market share as related to their licensing and merchandising divisions. And the DC Comics brand, thanks to years of mismanagement, is in an extremely vulnerable state. And right now, DC is not in a place where it is as competitive as it was a decade ago. Right now, they don't have the merchandising arm they had 10 years ago, and they wound up laying off almost 2/3 of their employees in 2 purges this year. So DC is in an extremely vulnerable position. Unfortunately, the big problem, with DC right now is the same management that messed up DC before is using the exact same approaches, and they don't understand that they're doing the exact same thing and they're expecting a different result. The thing that is hurting DC as a brand right now is the fact that every time they start to build some momentum, editorial does something to alienate the customer base. And what they are doing right now with this future state is they're getting ready to alienate the customer base with future state, and then looking to further compound it by putting grossly unqualified talent on the books after future state is over. And in a recent announcement, we had Mariko Tamaki announced to be the new writer of Detective Comics, and we had a writer of Green Lantern saying he did not like Hal Jordan. This is not a way to build fan support for a new run of comics, and this is not a way to try to get people interested when many are thinking about jumping off the brand. But many at DC, they really don't know how to set a direction as a publishing company, and they're in a complete, as I see it, mess right now. And when I look at future state, I see the New 52 all over again. And what's really troubling this time is DC is not in a place where it will be able to regroup, because right now, again, they don't have the merchandising arm that allows them to bring in the revenue, and they don't have the back catalog of books that from the backlist that is generating revenue, because we had Dan Didio back a couple of months ago before he was fired, and ending a lot of the reprints of certain books. So DC is really not in a good place, and relaunching with this whole future state, this is something that could practically lead to, as I see it, the complete collapse of DC Comics. And the whole thing is, it's absolutely unnecessary, because the whole idea, as I see it, of future state, it makes no logical sense when you have a multiverse to try to give us stories of a possible future of the DC universe. Because in a multiverse, we really do not really need to know the future of the DC universe, because we already have a fluid multiverse where we can tell different stories about different eras. So giving us a permanent future state that is something that other writers would be forced to adhere to, that makes no logical sense, because you already have things like the Metalverse from Dark Knight's Death Metal. You have the Dark Multiverse. You don't really need this in what DC is proposing as an so-called Omniverse. And this whole launch of product, if you did it as an alternate future, readers could have the option of walking away from it. But your DC wants to try to make some money on all of these pages that they've paid for, but they don't understand that sometimes it's best to take a short-term loss with a kill fee than take a long-term loss by launching product that not only does not sell with your already fragile audience that has already been alienated for an entire decade, but you may wind up losing more in the long term. So DC is trying to play the short game as related to getting sales on all of these pages they paid for, but in the long term, it may do a lot of catastrophic damage to the DC Comics brand. And the DC Comics brand has really suffered over the last decade or so, and the DC Comics brand, I don't think it can survive another hit like this, because the DC Comics brand right now, it's in the worst state I've ever seen it so far. And the clear solution to me for DC right now is they've got to find some way to get back to the classic DC universe, and they've got to find a way to get all of those readers back that they alienated. Unfortunately, when I look at their new boss, the Cherry guy, I don't really see a guy who's going to find a way to bring people together and build that bridge of bringing those old readers back. And when I look at plans like Future State, I see it driving more readers away. And there's this campaign to bring in other writers like Mariko Tamaki, who already have bad reputations. This may further alienate a lot of DC readers. I know DC is hurting for money right now, and they're looking to try to find cheaper alternatives for writers. But the whole thing is, there's a lot of great writers out there, but you don't go out here and get somebody with a name that is known for producing bad comics. I mean, you've got guys like myself who are quality writers. You go find one of us and ask us to write one of your projects, and maybe you'll start to get some sales because the book will be built on the character, and you'll eventually start to get some sales. It's a long, slow road, but it's one you're going to have to walk on. Unfortunately, DC doesn't want to walk on that road. They're trying to get back quickly like people did in the 90s, and unfortunately, we're not in a 1990s style comic book market where you can go out here and shock market somebody by saying, oh, we're putting so-and-so on this book, or we're going to do such and such gimmick. No, in this age right now where you're rebuilding, you're going to have to go out here and do what I do on the SJS Direct imprint, go out here and build the characters up with the stories, and then go out here and have good, talented, quality writers who can go out here and use social media like I do to try to promote and drum up sales for those titles, because that's the approach you're going to have to use. And it's going to be a long and hard road towards rebuilding. Unfortunately, DC may not be in a place where it can start that road to rebuilding, because we've had almost 2 decades of insanity, and this approach that they're using for Future State may be the crazy thing that winds up taking your DC out once and for all. Now, if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, and books like Eternal Night, you can find all of those books in paperback and Kindle format on Amazon.com, and some books are available on Kindle Unlimited. And if you want to try the first comic I've ever produced, E-Steam No Good Deed, you can pick up that comic in E-Steam Blast from the Past on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find it on Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me make more videos about comics and review comics, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle, Vampires Stalk the Darkness of the Eternal Night. Get your copy of Eternal Night in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com.